The storm arrived without mercy, but so did his invention. When the blizzard of '54 roared through the Wyoming wilderness, a lone homesteader's ice roof shelter became the unexpected salvation against nature's fury. But it wasn't just the roof that would save him, it was the secret he had uncovered in the deepest snowdrifts. Before we dive into this incredible survival tale, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're captivated by stories of survival and ingenuity, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode will blow you away even more. The wind howled across the barren plains, biting through the trees and carving paths through the snow. For James Wright, it wasn't just another winter storm, it was the beginning of a battle for survival. His small homestead, nestled against the jagged mountains of Wyoming, was no stranger to harsh winters, but nothing prepared him for what was coming. Inside his cabin, the warmth of the hearth struggled to fight off the cold that seemed to seep in through the cracks. James had spent the previous months reinforcing the structure, but the icy winds were relentless. The walls, though sturdy, groaned under the weight of the bitter cold. The small fire he had lit in the stone fireplace provided little comfort, just enough to remind him that his small cabin was still standing, but barely. He glanced out the window, watching the snow begin to fall in heavy sheets. The last storm had been bad, but this one was something else. It felt different. He knew better than to underestimate the wild, but something told him this was no ordinary Wyoming blizzard. For years, James had lived with the challenge of winter's unyielding grip. But it wasn't until a season ago, when he lost his closest friend to the cold, that he began obsessing over how to turn his cabin into something stronger, something that could withstand the very worst. The answer had come to him unexpectedly one evening, as he stood staring at the frozen lake near his home. The ice, the thick, unyielding ice, had sparked a thought. If ice could preserve life, why couldn't it be harnessed to protect life? That night, he sketched out a plan for an ice-roofed shelter, a radical idea. Most men built their homes to endure the seasons, but James was determined to make something that could endure nature's wrath. As the storm picked up, he turned from the window and glanced at the unfinished roof above him. He knew the storm would test it. His creation was about to face its first trial. Would it stand? Or would his innovation crumble under the weight of a winter stronger than any he had ever known? By morning, the blizzard had turned the world into an endless white void. The sky, a dull gray, cast an eerie light over the homestead. James stepped outside, his boots crunching in the deep snow as he surveyed the damage. The wind had torn through the open spaces, and the snow had piled high against his cabin. Yet, as he looked up, his heart raced with both pride and fear. The ice roof, which he had spent countless hours crafting, still stood strong, its surface gleaming under the dim light. It was unlike any roof he had seen before. Constructed from carefully layered ice blocks, it had taken weeks to perfect. Each block was placed with precision, and the gaps between them sealed with a mixture of snow and ice, allowing the roof to become a single, solid structure. The design was simple, but it was sturdy. It had to be. Inside the cabin, the warmth from the fire was already working its way through the structure, but the air was still sharp with cold. James crossed the threshold, his breath visible in the air as he moved to the hearth. The fire crackled, its flames weakly pushing back the encroaching chill. He'd been too focused on the roof to consider how the storm might affect the inside of his cabin. The roof, made from ice, was meant to absorb the cold and prevent it from entering, but the question remained. Would it be enough? Could this strange design hold its own against a storm of this magnitude? James pulled on his gloves, and then his coat, and stepped out again, determined to see his invention through. The howling winds threw ice and snow at him from all sides, stinging his skin like needles. He pressed forward, his eyes fixed on the cabin as he approached. As he reached the shelter, he saw it just for a moment. The wind shifted, and the sun peeked from behind the clouds. The ice roof, though covered in a layer of frost, reflected the sunlight with an intensity that made the snow around him shimmer. He hadn't anticipated this. The heat from the cabin was beginning to rise. The ice, so carefully placed, was holding its own against the storm. But could it truly protect him? The storm was still far from over, and the true test had only just begun. The wind had died down slightly by late afternoon, a fleeting lull before the true fury of the storm struck. James stood at the edge of his homestead, looking over the endless expanse of snow and wilderness stretching into the distance. The quiet was almost unnerving, unnatural. In this stillness, he could almost hear the cracking of the ice roof, the subtle shifts of his invention as it settled under the weight of the falling snow. Inside the cabin, the warmth from the hearth was palpable. The fire, though small, felt as though it could almost sustain the entire house. The roof, which had once been a mere experiment, now seemed like a fortress. James took a deep breath, leaning against the doorframe, and allowed himself a moment of pride. But he knew better than to trust nature's kindness for too long. His eyes wandered to the walls, the cracks in the wood, the gaps where the logs hadn't quite settled. He had made repairs over the years, but those weak points still existed. If the storm found a way inside, it would expose every vulnerability in his shelter. He turned back to the window, watching the faint line of the horizon. The sky had darkened again, the clouds thickening and swirling with increasing speed. The storm was gathering strength, and he could feel it in the air. The temperature was plummeting. James thought about the countless storms he had weathered before, how each one had been a test of his endurance, a reminder of the harsh reality of frontier life. His father had always told him that the land would give you everything you needed, but it would take away twice as much if you weren't prepared. Now, standing on the edge of the wilds, James felt that lesson more deeply than ever. He had never believed in luck. He had built his life on hard work, practical skills, and an unshakable will. He was no stranger to failure, but he had learned that every failure could be used as a stepping stone, each lesson shaping him into someone stronger. The ice roof was no different. The more he had worked on it, the more he believed it would be the thing to save him from the wrath of the wilds. But that belief was still just that belief, until the storm proved him right or wrong. The wind picked up again, this time stronger, howling through the cracks in the logs and rattling the door. James's breath quickened, and he turned, stepping toward the hearth once more. He needed to tend to the fire, keep it alive, keep it strong. But as he moved toward the hearth, something caught his eye. A small drift of snow, no larger than a hand, had begun to collect near the door. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him pause. The roof was designed to shed the snow, but the drifting was too heavy now. The first real test was coming, and he could feel the tension building in his chest. The storm was here. By midnight, the storm had become an unrelenting force. The wind screamed outside, its icy fingers reaching through the smallest cracks, rattling everything in its path. James was awake, his mind spinning with the intensity of the storm. He had spent the last few hours tending to the fire, adding more logs to the hearth, but it wasn't enough to quell the growing cold inside. The ice roof had been holding up so far, but now the snow piled higher, pressing down on the surface, threatening to collapse the very thing he had relied on. James moved swiftly to the window, his heart racing in his chest. The moon, obscured by swirling clouds, gave little light, but he could see the outline of his shelter covered in a thick blanket of snow, but still standing. Yet it was the sound that began to haunt him, the groaning of the roof under pressure, the faint but distinct cracking sound of ice beginning to shift. The weight was too much, he realized. The snow, once a promising layer of insulation, was now a burden, its weight growing with each passing moment. Inside the cabin, James quickly checked his fire, but the warmth was beginning to wane. His breath formed visible clouds in the air as the temperature dropped. It was the type of cold that seeped into your bones, numbing you before you even knew it. Panic began to set in, but he fought it down, forcing himself to focus. He had built this roof with every ounce of knowledge he had about the elements. Ice, snow, wood, it was supposed to work together. But now, in the face of nature's wrath, he wasn't sure if his construction would hold. Could it bear the weight of a storm like this? He had designed it to shed the snow, but the pressure was growing unbearable. James moved outside into the blizzard, his body immediately assaulted by the wind. The snow whipped at his face, and he had to squint to see through the fury of the storm. He approached the roof, each step slow and deliberate as he tested the strength of the structure. The snow that had collected on the roof was deep, but the ice remained firm, surprisingly resilient against the storm's assault. But then, a crack sounded through the night, sharp, sudden. James froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He moved quickly to the side of the cabin, eyes searching the roof. The crack had come from the far side, where the pressure had built up the most. He could see the weight of the snow shifting, and the ice began to bow inward, just slightly, but enough to make him nervous. With a sudden urgency, James raced around the cabin to the back, grabbing a long pole from the shed. He used it to push against the snow that had accumulated on the far side, trying to relieve the pressure. His muscles burned, and his fingers were numb from the cold, but he kept going. The weight needed to be redistributed, or the roof would collapse, and with it, his only shelter. The snow gave way, and a small avalanche of ice and powder slid off the roof, causing the structure to shudder. The groaning noise faded, and James held his breath as he stepped back, eyes scanning the roof. The worst had passed for now, but as he retreated back into the cabin, shivering from the cold, he knew that the storm was far from over. The ice roof had withstood its first test, but James wasn't sure how long it could hold out under the storm's fury. Would his creation survive the night? As the first light of dawn broke through the heavy storm clouds, James woke to find the world outside transformed. The snowstorm was still relentless, but something had changed. The air inside the cabin, though cold, held a stillness that hadn't been there the night before. The roof had withstood the weight of the storm for now, but it was a fragile truce. James's breath, visible in the morning chill, mixed with the faint scent of smoke from the hearth. The fire had nearly died out during the night, and he quickly got to work feeding it. His hands were stiff from the cold, but he moved efficiently, his mind still focused on the roof. Despite the damage he feared it had sustained, the roof was still intact. The snow had fallen off in some places, leaving patches of ice beneath, and the pressure had eased at least temporarily. James couldn't afford to relax, though. This was just the beginning. The storm still raged outside, and as he adjusted the fire, he couldn't shake the feeling that his invention was teetering on the edge of failure. He stepped back to the window, his eyes scanning the cabin's exterior. The once quiet, pristine landscape had transformed into a chaotic swirl of white. He could see the weight of the snow on the roof had increased in certain areas, but it wasn't the only thing he needed to worry about. The wind, howling with the fury of the storm, had started to shift. It was colder now, colder than it had been the night before. The temperature seemed to drop by the minute, and the fire, no matter how much he stoked it, couldn't quite push back the bite of the cold. James's mind raced as he thought about the nature of his roof. Ice, though durable, was not immune to nature's cruelty. A sudden gust of wind or a shift in temperature could shatter the fragile structure. The last thing he needed was for the roof to crack, or worse, collapse under the weight of the accumulating snow. He'd tested it at least. He thought he had, but nothing could truly prepare him for this kind of force. He needed to go outside again, make sure the roof was still holding. He bundled up as quickly as he could, pulling on layers of clothing to protect himself from the frigid air. Each movement was slow, deliberate, as the cold bit through every crack in his clothing. He stepped out into the storm, the snow nearly blinding him as the wind whipped across his face. His heart pounded as he made his way to the back of the cabin, his eyes fixed on the roof. It was holding barely. The snow had formed new layers, and the weight was heavier now. There was no telling how much longer it would last. As he approached the structure, James noticed something troubling. The cracks he had heard last night were no longer just sounds, they were visible. A thin line of frost had begun to form along the edges of the roof, and the ice had started to show small fissures. It wasn't much, but enough to make his stomach twist with fear. Was it finally giving way? Without wasting time, James ran to the back of the cabin, grabbing his long pole once again. This time, he wasn't just pushing snow away. He was prodding the ice, testing its strength. Each poke sent shivers through his spine, the cracking sound louder than he cared to admit. He cursed under his breath as the pressure of the snow continued to increase. He had one chance to stabilize it, or the roof would become a liability. He worked furiously, his hands aching from the cold, but as he prodded and pushed, the cracks seemed to ease. The snow had slid off in the right direction, and the weight on the roof was better distributed. He paused for a moment, listening to the wind and watching the clouds overhead. The storm had no intention of relenting any time soon, But for the first time since the blizzard began, James felt like he had the upper hand. He couldn't afford to get comfortable, but he had bought himself a little time. By late afternoon, the storm showed no signs of easing, yet James found himself oddly calm. The wind howled, the snow continued to pile up, but there was a strange quiet in the cabin. The roof, though battered by the storm, had held together. The cracks he had seen earlier had not grown worse, and the snow that had piled up during the night seemed to have settled more evenly. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled more comfortably than it had before, the warmth creeping along the walls and into his bones. James sat near the hearth, exhausted but oddly content. It wasn't a relief exactly, more like a brief respite. He knew that the battle wasn't over. The storm was still howling outside, and there were more trials ahead, but in this moment it felt like he had won something that wasn't just about surviving the storm, but about conquering it. He thought back to when he first came up with the idea for the ice roof. He had been driven by a need for survival, a desire to build something that could protect him against the unpredictable nature of the wilderness. He had worked tirelessly, obsessing over the smallest details, tweaking the design, and testing its limits. He had been so focused on the practicality of it all that he hadn't allowed himself to consider the deeper implications of his invention. Now, as he sat in the warmth of the cabin, watching the snow swirl outside, he realized that it was more than just a shelter. It was a reflection of his own resolve, a physical manifestation of his determination to withstand whatever came his way. The ice roof was not just a survival mechanism, it was a statement. A reminder that in the face of overwhelming odds, human ingenuity could stand firm. The night grew darker, and the wind seemed to pick up again. But James wasn't afraid anymore. He had learned something in the past day, something fundamental. Nature could be cruel, relentless, and unforgiving, but as long as there was breath in his lungs, there was always a way to fight back. And in that moment, as the storm raged on outside, James felt ready to face whatever came next. The storm persisted through the night and into the next day, but James hardly noticed the passing hours. His focus remained on the ice roof, and, more importantly, on how it continued to defy the odds. The weight of the snow had grown heavier, but instead of cracking under pressure, the roof had remained stable, even as the snow accumulated at an alarming rate. It was almost as though the storm itself had been defied by this simple, yet ingenious structure. Inside the cabin, the fire continued to flicker weakly, but it was enough to ward off the chill. James had grown accustomed to the cold, but this was a different kind of cold, one that seeped into his very bones. The cabin was far warmer than the frozen landscape outside, but even so, he found himself shivering at the mere thought of what lay beyond the walls. James knew that no matter how resilient the roof seemed now, the true test was yet to come. The snow would continue to fall, and the weight would grow. The ice roof had performed admirably in the initial hours of the storm, but the pressure would eventually reach a breaking point. And in the wilds of Wyoming, there were no second chances. He couldn't afford to fail. Stepping out into the harsh winds once again, James took a deep breath, his breath a visible cloud in the frigid air. He moved toward the roof, eyes scanning the structure for any sign of weakness. The first crack he had heard earlier had not deepened, but that did little to ease his worries. The storm was unrelenting, and each gust of wind felt like a direct challenge to his creation. He reached the edge of the cabin, where the snow was piled the highest. His hands, numb from the cold, grabbed hold of his pole, and he began to prod at the ice again, testing its stability. The roof groaned under the pressure, but there was no cracking, no indication that the structure was on the verge of collapse. The weight of the snow was immense, but it wasn't enough to break the ice roof. Not yet. The design was holding just. James was certain that another few hours of snow would be the final test. Would the structure hold under the increasing pressure? Or would it collapse, taking his shelter with it? He had worked so hard to make this work. Every log he had laid, every inch of ice he had carefully placed, had been in anticipation of this very moment. The storm was a reminder of the wilderness' unforgiving nature. But it was also a test of his own strength, determination, and resolve. Could his ingenuity be enough to defeat nature's most brutal force? As he stepped back to survey the roof, the wind howled again, sending a gust of snow sweeping over him. His heart raced as he glanced up at the ice roof. It was still standing, still holding, but for how much longer? It was the quiet that unsettled James most. The wind still screamed through the gaps in the cabin's walls, but the ferocity of the storm had diminished slightly, as if the wilderness had momentarily paused to catch its breath. The pressure on the roof was immense. James could feel it in his chest, as though the very air around him was thick with the weight of the snow that had accumulated over the last few days. He had spent hours outside, prodding and pushing at the ice, trying to redistribute the snow and ease the burden, but now, standing inside the cabin, he knew that he couldn't delay the inevitable much longer. The roof had done its job admirably. Despite the mounting weight, the design had proven more resilient than James had expected. But the storm was far from over, and he could feel the roof beginning to shift under the relentless weight. The ice, which had seemed so sturdy just a day ago, was starting to show signs of strain. Cracks were beginning to form in the surface, and for the first time, James heard the unmistakable sound of ice beginning to give way. Outside, the wind had shifted again, this time blowing harder, as if the storm was growing in strength once more. The snow continued to fall, thick and fast, piling higher and higher. Inside, the air had grown colder despite the fire. James could see his breath clouding in front of him, his fingers stiff from the cold. He had been in worse situations before, but this felt different. The roof was his only protection from the storm, and it was beginning to fail. His heart pounded in his chest as he moved to the window, watching the snow whip across the landscape. The horizon was nearly invisible, swallowed by the swirling white. He stepped back from the window and glanced at the fire. It was sputtering, the warmth quickly being drained by the cold air. The roof was no longer enough to keep out the frigid bite of the blizzard. With a deep breath, James made his decision. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to act before the roof completely gave way. He grabbed his coat, bundled up as best he could, and stepped back out into the storm. This time, there would be no more testing or second-guessing. He would either stabilize the roof or face the consequences. The snow whipped around him, the wind slamming into his face like 1,000 knives. He moved quickly to the back of the cabin, where the roof had been under the most pressure. The ice was visibly cracking now, the thin lines spreading like veins across the surface. James grabbed his pole and began to push against the snow, working quickly to relieve the pressure on the roof. It wasn't enough. He moved to the side of the cabin, eyes searching for any way to redistribute the weight. But the snow kept falling, and the wind kept howling, and the roof groaned under the immense pressure. He could feel it in his bones. The roof was buckling. The inevitable had come. He had given everything he had, but it wouldn't be enough. The roof groaned louder, and then just as James reached out to brace it, the ice cracked with a deafening sound. The crack sounded like thunder, loud and final, echoing through the stillness of the storm. James's heart skipped a beat as he instinctively stepped back from the roof, his breath catching in his throat. He could feel the weight shift, the tension of the ice roof as it finally reached its breaking point. The structure had held strong for days, but now the accumulated weight of the snow and the unrelenting force of the storm were too much. For a moment, everything stood still. The wind stopped howling. The snow paused in mid-air as if nature itself held its breath. Then, with a shuddering crack, the ice roof collapsed. James barely had time to react before a deluge of snow and ice crashed down onto the cabin. The force of the impact shook the ground beneath him, sending a blast of cold air into the interior of the shelter. The roof had crumpled in on itself, bringing with it a cascade of ice, snow, and the remnants of the fragile structure. James was thrown backward, his body colliding with the snowbank beside the cabin. He scrambled to his feet, blinking against the stinging snow that whipped around him. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked up at the cabin. The once proud roof was now a pile of fractured ice and snow, its edges jagged and uneven. The cabin itself seemed to have weathered the collapse better than James had expected. The walls were intact, but the entryway was buried under a thick mound of snow. Panic gripped him. The roof had collapsed, but the structure of the cabin itself remained. That was the good news. The bad news? He was trapped outside in a full-on blizzard, and the cabin's entrance was now sealed shut by a pile of snow and ice. For a few seconds, James stood frozen in disbelief. the weight of the situation sinking in. His breath came in shallow gasps as the wind howled once more, but there was no time for fear. His mind clicked into action. The roof had failed, but his shelter had survived barely. He had to get inside and ensure he had time to make repairs before the next wave of the storm hit. With grim determination, James moved quickly to the side of the cabin, using his pole to start digging through the thick snow. Each shovelful felt like an eternity, but he kept going, desperate to clear the entrance. The cold was unbearable, the snow beginning to melt and refreeze with every new layer, making the task even harder. His hands, already numb from exposure, were growing stiff, but he couldn't afford to stop. The storm continued to rage, snow falling harder with each passing minute. He could barely see the end of the cabin from where he stood, and the wind made it feel as though the storm was attacking him from all sides. But still, he dug, determined to free himself from the icy prison that had formed around him. An hour passed, and finally, just as his energy seemed to drain away, he broke through. The weight of the snow had given way, and the door was now accessible. James stumbled into the cabin, his hands trembling from the cold, and closed the door behind him, collapsing onto the floor. His body ached from the ordeal, and the fire, though faint, still provided some warmth. But as he sat in the silence recovering, James knew the roof was beyond repair. He had done all he could to make the shelter work, but it had failed when it mattered most. Yet, in the quiet of the cabin, he also realized that he had survived. The collapse hadn't destroyed him, and his homestead was still standing. The storm had tested him, and in the end, it was his resolve, not his invention, that had seen him through. The storm began to slow by the third day, leaving behind a world coated in white, the landscape transformed by the fury of nature. The wind had calmed, and the snow had settled, blanketing everything in a deep, undisturbed silence. It was a quiet James had come to know and respect, for it always came after the storm, a final reminder that survival depended on patience, persistence, and never giving up. As the days passed, James worked tirelessly to repair his shelter. He knew the roof could never be the same again, but it wasn't the ice roof that had saved him. It was his resourcefulness, his determination, and the sheer will to survive that had pulled him through the worst of the storm. He spent hours clearing the rubble and melting the snow around the cabin. The fire crackled steadily now, heating the small space and offering him the comfort he so desperately needed. Every inch of his body ached, but his spirit was still strong. The storm had come at him with everything it had, but it had not broken him. As he sat by the fire, looking out over the desolate landscape, James reflected on everything that had led him here. The roof, though it had failed, had been a bold idea, one he had believed in. He had learned that even the best ideas could falter when pushed to their limits. But in the end, it wasn't about the failure, it was about how you responded to it. And James had responded with everything he had: strength, resolve, and the drive to survive. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, James knew that his time on the frontier was far from over. There would be more storms, more challenges, more tests. But he would meet each one with the same grit and determination that had carried him through the worst blizzard of his life. He had learned that it wasn't just about building shelter, it was about building the strength to stand up after each fall. He was a homesteader, a survivor of the frontier, and his story was just beginning.